What's up guys, hope you're having a good day, and yes, you did read the title of this video correctly. It is not clickbait. I am going to be betting Aldana to beat Amanda Nunes this weekend at UFC 289. And in this video, I'm going to be showing you the reasons why I think Aldana is potentially a very difficult stylistic matchup for Amanda Nunes. So some of you watching this will think I'm crazy. Others will think I'm totally setting fire to my hard-earned money. Others will maybe agree, particularly after you see some of the things I'm going to show you. Maybe you've done your own research on this one. You've also identified there are a few things Aldana does particularly well that could cause Nunes a problem. And of course, many of you may think I'm a crazy person. I know that Amanda Nunes, one of the greatest female fighters of all time, she's rated very highly on paper. So it looks like a very difficult stylistic matchup for Amanda Nunes. Sorry, for Aldana. But even though you may think I'm a little bit crazy, I've been performing really well on pre-fight bets this year. As you guys know, I keep it very tight. I don't place many pre-fight bets. My speciality is live betting on the UFC, live betting on football. That's my bread and butter. But obviously I am profitable pre-fight betting the UFC as well. I do dabble on it. As you can see, this area here been on a really nice uptrend since July 2022. So for almost a year now, we've been grinding out non-stop profits, nice steady uptrend with the results. And this is basically because I made the change to my pre-fight betting strategy. So as you can see here, we've kind of jumped around and floated around break even for a long time, and this is obviously not acceptable. So I sat down and I was like, why do I keep making a bit and then giving a bit back, and making a bit, giving a bit back, making a bit, giving a bit back? Why does this cycle keep repeating? Why can't I just grind those profits up? And I basically identified a few different types of bets which were consistently costing me money, and I've just eliminated them entirely. And so Aldana kind of fits into one of those bets that has performed particularly well for me. And so I don't know if it's going to win this weekend, but it certainly fits the type of bet that has been helping me grind out profits for a year now. So yeah, obviously this is sketchy, sideways, but you can see we've definitely turned the corner in the last year, and I'd expect it to continue because, you know, the strategy I'm using now I feel is really, really robust and works really well. So if you like these breakdown videos and you would like to watch breakdown videos for all the prelim fights on this card, head on over to my website, mmabettingtips.com. On there you'll find all my bets for every single UFC event you've just seen. I'm profitable on pre-fight betting, so if you want to gain access to them, you'll find them all on my website, as well as breakdown videos for every single fight on every single UFC card, and you can use them as kind of a strategy guide if you like, you know, this content. These videos help you, you know, think about your bets and do your own research, maybe save you time. You don't have to do your own research. Then you can get more of them for the prelim fights. So check it out, mmabettingtips.com. Link for that in the description below. We'll also have a Discord server coming soon. You can gain access to it at the moment if you are a paying member of the site, but I'm going to make it free in the near future. I just need to set a few things up and then we can get that going. So yeah, check out the website, and there are also spaces available to live bet with me this weekend. So live betting UFC, like I say, is my bread and butter. It is my speciality, and as you can see, we perform really well on live betting. We hardly ever have a losing quarter. So nice, steady, consistent profits over the last 8 years, dating back to February 2016. It's my cash cow. And yeah, if you like watching every single UFC event live, my live betting tips are a way to basically earn a little bit of money while you do that. Not a little bit, actually a lot after a while, once you build your account balances up and, you know, use compound interest to grow your account balances. But anyway, that's a topic for another day. If you'd like to give live betting a try, you can sign up on the site now. If you don't like it, no problem. Get in contact with me, email, DM, however you want to do it. Give you a refund, no problem. But I think you'll love it because, yeah, you basically earn money while watching the UFC. What is there not to like about that? So, without further ado, don't even know what that means, but it's time for us to get into breaking down the main event of this card, which is Amanda Nunes against Aldana. Now, obviously, no spoilers or sorry, spoiler alert with this breakdown, because you guys already know that I've bet Irene Aldana this weekend. So let's take a deep dive into this matchup between Nunes and Aldana from a betting perspective. Now, most of you that have been watching my content for a long time, and if you're an experienced gambler, what I'm about to say will, it will be stating the obvious. You'll completely get it. But whenever I do place a bet on a fight such as this, it is important I just give like a little context behind the reasoning for the bet, because less experienced gamblers look at bets in a very literal way, in the sense that if a bet loses, they just think you got the fight, or your assessment of the fight was completely wrong. You got wrecked. You're a clueless idiot, and it was a terrible bet. They take a very, very simplified view of, of betting, basically. So I personally feel it's more likely Amanda Nunes wins this fight. She is better than Aldana everywhere. She's a significantly better grappler. She's also a better striker. She's also one of the greatest female fighters to ever live. So this is one of those fights where I do think Nunes is more likely to win. So at this stage, less experienced gamblers watching this video are going to be like, well, if you think Nunes is going to win, why the fuck would you bet on Irene Aldana? That makes absolutely no sense. And of course, more experienced gamblers will know the reason why we sometimes do that is when a fighter who is less likely to win gives us a very favourable risk to reward ratio. So if we take a look at the odds on this one, and I'll just refresh the page to make sure we got the latest odds, we can see that Amanda Nunes is around about a 1.30 favourite, which is going to be minus 333 for an implied probability of 77%. So to get any value in betting on Amanda Nunes this weekend, you've got to give her like an 80% chance of winning, which is a very difficult thing to do in MMA because of how chaotic and random of a sport it is. So if we take a look at the odds on Irene Aldana, she's around an average of 3.60, which is going to be plus 260 for an implied probability of 28%. So to get a little bit of value on Aldana here, you've only really got to give her like a 33-35% chance of winning, and you've got a decent margin over the bookie. So while I do think it's more likely Nunes wins this fight this weekend, I think Aldana gives you a fantastic risk to reward ratio, because while I absolutely agree Nunes is better than Aldana everywhere from a technical point of view, we know that if making money betting on MMA was as simple as identifying who the more skilled fighter was and betting on them, then we'd all be millionaires, because it's very easy to do that. I can train my mum to research MMA fights and identify who is the more technically skilled. That is not a difficult thing to do, but we know so much more goes into the outcome of an MMA fight, the condition of a fighter, their mentality, their game planning, their strategy, their decision making, their cardio. There's so much more that goes into it, and there are opportunities in those areas for Aldana to cause an upset here. So I personally cap Aldana at about 40% in this. So while I do think it's more likely that Nunes wins, I give Aldana a way better shot of winning than the odds suggest. And yeah, cap it at 40% gives us a nice, decent margin over the bookie in this instance. So what are the reasons why I like Aldana this weekend? I'm going to show you with some footage, but we'll start off with the tail of the tape and the X factors. So Nunes is 35 years old, 5'8" with a 69-inch reach. Aldana, 35 years old, 5'9" with a 68.5-inch reach. So straight away, virtually identical, both the same age and both pretty much the same size. But in itself, there are a couple of X factors, a couple of subtle ones to dig into. So as we know, Amanda Nunes has flirted with the idea of retirement before. She has talked about it. She significantly underperformed in that first fight against Juliana Pena. And we talk about this regularly, right? Whenever a fighter brings up the dreaded R word, it's almost always the beginning of the end. Their career almost always falls off a cliff. It doesn't matter whether they retire or not. As soon as they mention the R word, they literally fall apart. A few weeks ago, we bet on Tainara Lisboa to beat Jessica Rose Clark in the even money odds range, and obviously Lisboa came through for us in a huge way. And one of the main reasons why we bet Lisboa was because Jessica Rose Clark had mentioned retirement in the past, and we know when a fighter mentions retirement, it's always the beginning of the end. So the fact that Nunes has even hinted at retirement is a big red flag, because if you look at the trajectory and the motivation that both fighters are coming into this matchup with this weekend, Nunes is thinking about retirement. She's probably already got one foot out the door. She's probably thinking about life after fighting with her wife Nina Nunes and her child, and she's got another child on the way. She's made her money, she's had her career, she's had her time. Is she really going to be as hungry, as motivated, as driven as someone like Irene Aldana, who hasn't won a title, who hasn't made tons of money, who's still probably hungry, still very driven, and still dreams of becoming a UFC champion? When you look at these two, even though they're the same age, I feel they're at very different stages in their career, where Aldana's going to have that fire, that desire to win. She's going to dream of being a champion, and this is a great opportunity for her. GSP famously said that fighting was 90% mental, and with a fight like this, with Aldana, you've got not young, but you've got a tough, hungry, motivated, driven Mexican that's reasonably well-rounded, with a great gas tank, who's tough as nails, one-shot knockout power, facing, yes, one of the greatest of all time, but where's her motivation at? And obviously, this isn't a sport where you could be 1 foot in, 1 foot out. You've got to be all in, because if you're not fully committed to it, the universe will make you pay. And if Nunes is thinking about retirement, if her heart's not really in it anymore, does she still have what it takes to dig deep and outdog a Mexican dog like Aldana? She didn't against Juliana Pena in the first fight. And Aldana poses some significant threats towards Nunes, which Pena did not. So if we talk about how these two match up stylistically, we'll start off with grappling, because grappling is an area where there's no ambiguity. There's no ambiguity at all. So Nunes is a significantly better grappler. She's a strong wrestler, good grappling control, high-level Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu black belt. Aldana's takedown defense isn't terrible, but it's not particularly good either. She's quite a low level on the ground. She's not the best off her back, and there are levels and levels and levels and levels between these two. But remember what I said at the beginning of this breakdown. If betting on this fight, or if making money from betting on MMA was as simple as determining who's the more skilled fighter, then we'd all be millionaires. It's an easy thing to do. And while Nunes is levels and levels and levels above Aldana on the ground, there are things on the ground that Aldana does which potentially poses quite a big threat to Amanda Nunes. Now, I don't want this breakdown to be super long. This breakdown could be, this breakdown could legitimately be an hour long. I could show you loads of footage, go into this one in a lot of depth. I'm not going to do that. I'm going to show you a little bit of footage, but for some other stuff, you're either going to have to take my word for it or do your own research with fights I'm going to give you the reference. Nunes' problem is that while she is a much better grappler than Aldana from a technical point of view, because Nunes is one of these big, strong, powerful, physically imposing fighters, that physicality, that power comes at a cost. And so she is very physically imposing on the ground. She's very strong on the ground. But Nunes is kind of cursed in the sense that the more she grapples, the faster she gasses out. And the best example I can give you of this is her fight against Germaine de Randamie. Now, it's 25 minutes long. I'm not going to pull up footage and show you. But if you're interested in seeing what I mean, go back and watch that fight. Amanda Nunes used a grappling heavy game plan in that fight against de Randamie. And even though de Randamie didn't make her work hard at all on the ground, she gave up cheap takedowns, just lied on her back doing nothing. Despite this, Nunes was absolutely gassed out of her mind against Germaine de Randamie. And had de Randamie had anything that resembled any form of takedown defense, strongly believed de Randamie would have beaten Amanda Nunes that night, because Nunes was absolutely exhausted. She was just gassed out of her mind. So this fight's interesting because the one area where Nunes does have a big advantage over Irene Aldana, it kind of comes at a cost, because while Nunes can cause Aldana big problems on the ground, there is a point of diminishing returns where the more she grapples, the more tired she's going to get, which then, as the fight progresses, is going to make her grappling less effective and also her striking less effective as well. And while Aldana is nowhere near as skilled as Amanda Nunes on the ground, where Aldana poses a threat to Nunes is her ability to make you constantly work on the ground to control her. So while Aldana's not the best off her back, she's not the best at working her way back up to her feet. She's not the best grappler from a technical point of view. Her takedown offense isn't good. Her strength is that she constantly makes you work. She's very scrambly. She's always working. She's always trying to create space for herself off her back. And because she's got that Latin American, Mexican gas tank, she just doesn't tire out. She's just as scrambly on the ground in the first minute as she is in the 25th minute. She just doesn't stop. She's relentless. So the big difference between someone like Irene Aldana and a Germaine de Randamie is that even though they're both very bad on the ground, when Nunes takes someone like de Randamie down, or in fact someone like Juliana Pena in their second fight, Nunes hasn't got to exert much energy to get the takedown, because fighters like Pena, fighters like de Randamie are a lot easier to take down than Aldana. And then when the fight's on the ground, Nunes doesn't have to exert much energy to control them, because both de Randamie and Pena are fighters who are just very weak off their back, and they'll just lie on their back doing nothing. Aldana's more difficult to take down than those two fighters, which means Nunes is going to have to expend more energy to get the fight to the ground. And on top of that, when you get the fight to the ground, Aldana's constantly attacking with submissions, constantly trying to improve her position, constantly trying to create space for herself off her back, constantly trying to create scrambles. Is she good at doing any of those things? No, she isn't particularly good at doing any of those things. But the fact that she does do those things is going to force Amanda Nunes to react. And Amanda Nunes is going to have to counter. She's going to have to work on the ground to neutralize everything that Aldana is trying to do. And that'll burn through energy. That'll accelerate the rate at which Nunes slows down, which will then make it harder for her to generate the energy required to get Aldana to the ground, harder for her to have success on the ground, harder for her to be an effective striker. So while technically Nunes is a nightmare for Aldana on the ground, Aldana has a good enough level of grappling for the most part to defend herself on the ground. Yes, she's going to take some damage with ground and pound. Nunes may get some nasty submission attempts. Maybe she does submit Aldana, but for the most part, Aldana's not easy to get out there. She's a tough Mexican, and if she can hang in there with Nunes, make her work hard on the ground, this fight going to get very, very interesting. But obviously, these two fighters are primarily strikers, and the one thing they have in common about their styles of striking is that they are two of the very, very few female fighters in the UFC today that have true legit knockout power. There are very few female fighters in the UFC that possess the power in one shot to just put you away, but these are two of them for sure. They both hit very, very hard. They both got big knockout power. They both do a lot of damage. They're both very, very dangerous on the feet. But what really separates these two is the pace in which they are capable of fighting at. So again, Amanda Nunes is very powerful, very physically imposing, very athletic, very explosive, but all of this comes at a cost, where she slows down significantly as the fight wears on. When that happens, her grappling becomes a lot less effective, so does her striking. And so the way in which Nunes tries to manage this is she uses her power and the threat of her grappling to put her opponents into a defensive shell. And when she does this, this enables her to pace herself. So if you think about examples where Nunes has looked pretty good, You've got the Jermaine Durandame fight. You've got the Raquel Pennington fight. And of course, good is subjective, right? There are some people that are very impressed by quick finishes. Personally, I don't think quick finishes teach us that much about a fighter. I want to see, 25-minute wars of attrition where fighters are tested in all areas and we can really see how their entire skill set looks. So when I'm talking about fights where Nunes looked good versus fights where she didn't look so good, I want to be focusing on the ones where we actually saw a decent amount of stuff happen, not one where she's just fucking caught someone with a bomb and knocked them out inside 2 minutes. So if you look at the performances where Nunes has looked good, looked amazing in the Raquel Pennington fight, looked pretty good in the Shevchenko fight considering how good Shevchenko is. She looked alright, I guess, in the Pena rematch. Where are the fights where she didn't look so good? Well, she didn't look so good in the Durandame fight. Definitely didn't look good in this Juliana Pena fight. And what you notice between those two different groups, where we saw different sides of Nunes, was the thing that dictated how Nunes looked in these matchups was the pace in which they were fought at. So if you look at the fight with Valentina Shevchenko, Raquel Pennington, the most recent fight against Juliana Pena, what you notice in those three fights is that throughout the entirety, Nunes is allowed to dictate the pace. She's in total control. So she puts Raquel Pennington into a defensive shell early. As soon as Pennington feels her power, she doesn't really attack Nunes. She just stands back and just allows Nunes to chip away at her for 5 rounds. The Shevchenko fight was a chess match. Very, very slow pace. Both girls just stood in front of one another for 5 rounds. Neither of them did a whole lot. And they both just chipped away at each other and point fighted. And then in the most recent fight against Juliana Pena, Nunes started to catch Pena with some big shots on the feet and hurt her. Took her down, beat her up on the ground. And essentially put Pena into a defensive shell where Pena was finding it difficult to come forward and attack Nunes. Because every time she did, Nunes would punish her with either a takedown or big damage. This put Pena into a defensive shell. This enabled Nunes to pace herself in that matchup. What was different about the first Pena fight? Well, the difference was when Pena came forward and attacked Amanda Nunes decided to stand her ground, play Rock'em Sock'em Robots, get into these big exchanges with Pena, and essentially adrenaline dumped against a fighter with a better gas tank. The difference with the rematch was that she realised getting into a firefight with Pena was potentially risky, because if she didn't get the finish, she'd gas out and then be too tired to defend herself. So what she then did instead in the second fight was pick their shots. She would land a bomb, and then when Pena would kind of come forward and then try and get a big exchange going, she would just back up, circle away, and when Pena would come forward, bang, land another bomb, and she would keep punishing Pena without having to exert a lot of energy, throw in a lot of strikes. So it was very different. Both fights were very different tactically from Nunes. And I want to actually show you the difference, because then when I show you some footage of Irene Aldana, it'll start to make sense why Aldana is potentially a really difficult stylistic matchup here. So this is the first fight against Juliana Pena. So where you start to see Pena, when you start to see Nunes run into trouble in this fight, is that she fights at a pace which is not sustainable for her. So she doesn't respect Pena. Nunes' approach to this fight is that there's no way that Pena is going to be able to survive in there with her for very long. It's only a matter of time before she knocks Pena out. So she just doesn't pace herself. So again, I don't want to make this breakdown super long, but you can see low calf kick there, and straight away you can just see lots of activity from Nunes. Whenever Pena lets her hands go, she's coming right back, and you can just see Nunes is starting fast. She wants to be the aggressor. She wants to put Pena on the back foot. She's really taking the fight to her early. You can see there as Pena's coming forward in these exchanges. Notice how Nunes is immediately trying to get it back. Look at her body language. She comes right back on top of Pena looking to get in these exchanges. So what's actually happening here is very subtle, But what's actually happening is Nunes is trying to put a pace on Pena and be the alpha dog. She's trying to break Pena in there. She's trying to break her will. She's trying to get her out of there. And so every time Pena has a little bit of success, lands a shot, any little bit of success that Pena has, Nunes is trying to re-establish dominance by immediately taking momentum away from Pena and going right back to being the aggressor. And so you see it throughout this fight. A very, very aggressive start from Pena. A very, very aggressive start from Nunes. So the striking is where, and this is another. I'll just quickly cover this off. I'll just very, very quickly cover this off because it is relevant. So remember earlier in the breakdown when I said Nunes is cursed in many ways, because even though she's a very strong grappler, she is one of these grapplers that the more she grapples, the faster she gets tired. This first round is a really good example, because what you've seen in the second Pena fight and her fight against Germaine de Randamie is she would pace herself better on the ground. So she would get a takedown and then she would spend a long period of time just in her opponent's guard, on top of them, chipping away at them, but not exerting a whole lot of energy. This was different because Nunes was constantly attacking on the ground. So watch, when she jumps on top of Pena here in the side control, she's immediately trying to do stuff. She's immediately trying to flatten Pena out, establish a dominant position, attack with submissions. Like you see here, Pena gets back up, but Nunes immediately hits a judo throw, get the fight back to the ground. But she's very, very active on the ground. In the fights against de Randamie, the second Pena fight, she's just looking to flatten both girls out, control them from top position. Here, she wants to do bad things to Pena on the ground. She wants to beat her up. Look, she's trying to take her back here. So here she's exerting energy on this rear naked choke. She's trying to step over, advancing the mount here. Here she's trying to set up a guillotine. By the look of it, she's looking over to her corner and smiling as if to say, this bitch ain't got nothing for me. Little smile there. Little sadistic smile. But you could basically see she's doing stuff on the ground. And this is very, very different from the de Randamie fight, the second fight against Pena, where she focused much more on control than offense. So you got another takedown there. Anyway, into round two. So point being, she exerted a decent amount of energy on the ground in those grappling positions. There was quite an intense grappling exchange where a lot of stuff happened. Now again, pay attention to the pacing here, because what you'll see is Nunes refused to take a backward step. When Pena attacks her, she stands her ground, fires right back. And you'll see very, very different dynamic in the rematch. So you can see Nunes has felt Pena out in the first round. There you go, jab for jab there. She's dominated her on the ground. She's felt very comfortable on the feet. So she's looking to start round two again very, very quickly. Now she's smiling. Look, she's smiling here. She's smiling. She's very confident. She is supremely confident here. And you see here, right? Pena lands a shot here and she's immediately right back on top of her. Look, Nunes straight back on top of her, not backing up an inch, standing her ground, firing back. Look, she's leg kicking her, she's jabbing her. Nunes wants to be alpha dog here. She is not taking a backward step. Look at this. She will not back up. Look at this. Doesn't take a backward step. Look at this exchange. Doesn't take a backward step. Plants her feet and just stands right in the pocket and exchanges. Look at this. She won't take a backward step. And in amongst all of this, she's not pacing herself. She's not controlling her breathing. She's not keeping her heart rate under control. And look at this. She won't take a backward step. Pena's landing big shots. She will not take a backward step because she doesn't respect Pena. She's just standing in the pocket. Wants to be alpha dog. Look, she trusts in her power. Look, lands a big shot on Pena there. Comes right back on top of her. But what you'll notice is, look at how sloppy Nunes is starting to get. Look at how her hand speed is slower. How she doesn't have the same pop, the same impactfulness on her shots. So she's starting to get sloppy. She's starting to get tired. Her power, her snap is dissipating from her shots. Like, look at how slow her hand speed is now compared to earlier in the fight. And now she doesn't have the power to hurt Pena. So you can see Pena's able to stand right in the pocket now and go toe-to-toe. And now she's able to push Nunes back because Nunes' arms are so tired, she doesn't have the same impactfulness on her shots to push Pena back. Look at this. Nunes just going toe-to-toe. She's sprinting. Look at this. Look at this. Crazy. Toe-to-toe. Will not take a backward step. And again, I don't want to make this breakdown like super long, but it's a complex fight. Very, very complex fight. Anyway, you look at how gassed she is here. Her arms, speed, slow, tired. You get it, man. You fucking get it. You get it. You know what I'm trying to say. Just waiting for the finish. But anyway, the point I'm trying to make is, from the first second of this fight till the last, Nunes sprinted, and she didn't pace herself, which means she gassed bad. And then Pena was able to make her pay. Eventually, when we get there. There we go. Takedown, rear naked choke, job done. You've seen it all before. So what makes the rematch so different? Why was Pena so dominant in the rematch? Let me show you. Sorry, why was Nunes so dominant in the rematch? It's a very different fight. We talk about this in our live betting group every single week. Game planning, fight IQ, strategy are the most important aspects of MMA. How skilled a fighter is has nowhere near to do with how successful they are. Nowhere near as much to do with how successful they are as game planning, fight IQ, strategy. So in the first fight between Pena and Nunes, what you notice is from the first second to the last, Nunes is sprinting. She's doing all kinds of stuff to Pena on the ground. She's standing in the pocket playing rock'em sock'em robots with Pena in that second round, even though Pena has got a much better gas tank and she's tough as nails. So what adjustment did she make in the second fight? Well, she took all that energy that she exerted in the first 7 or 8 minutes of that first fight and she spread it out across 25. So she didn't fade as hard early. She definitely faded in this fight, but nowhere near as hard. So now you're probably wondering, well, hang on a minute. Even if you're probably thinking to yourself now, the naysayers that are questioning what I am saying, their question will be, well, it doesn't matter that Nunes exerted less energy because Pena is still going to have forced her to work. And this brings me back to my point of how when Nunes is at her best, she's getting her opponents to respect the threats that she brings to the table and putting them into a defensive shell so that she can pace herself. Think about the Shevchenko fight where she didn't gas. Why didn't she gas? Because Shevchenko didn't take the fight to her like Pena did in that first matchup. They were in the middle of the octagon and they just exchanged shots and point fighted for 25 minutes. The Raquel Pennington fight, she didn't gas. Why? Because Pennington was in a defensive shell early. She didn't attack Nunes. She enabled Nunes to dictate the pace of the fight. And look at the difference here. We're almost a minute and a half into this first round. Nunes hasn't done anything. And look at this now. Look at the difference in body language now. Look at what you have now. Look at this. What happened in the first fight? What happened the first time they fought? When Pena came forward and attacked Nunes. Watch this. Pena comes forward. Attack, attack, attack. And look at what Nunes does. She's like, cool. Stays patient. Stays patient. Stays patient. Doesn't fire back. She's like, cool, you can have it. Doesn't react. What did Nunes do in the first fight? Fuck you, bitch. I'm not letting you get away with that. Stands her ground. Comes forward. Lets her hands go. Tries to get it back. Nunes was way more patient in the rematch. Look, she's not doing anything. She's not doing anything. She's controlling her breathing, her heart rate. She's staying calm, relaxed, composed. And because of that, look, we're 2 minutes into the fight. She hasn't done anything. Barely does anything. In the first 4 minutes, she barely does anything. So you compare how much energy she exerted in this first 4 minutes compared to the first 4 minutes of the first fight. Completely different. Completely different. And slowly as the fight progresses, she gets more and more aggressive. Where she starts to use her grappling tactically. And what you can see is, in the first fight, Nunes felt that her power, her athleticism, her skills would be too much for Pena to handle. She didn't respect her. So she just sprinted from the first second. She redlined it. She took the fight to Pena. She was relentless. In this fight, she trusted in her power. She trusted in her technique. She trusted in the fact that Pena's quite slow and not the best defensively. And so rather than get into these big exchanges with Pena, where they'd be playing rock'em sock'em robots and exert a lot of energy, instead she picked her shots. That's what was different about this one. Look, she's barely done anything in round one, but she trusts that if she stays patient, she'll catch Pena with something. Boom, there it is. But look at the difference this time. Look how different this is. In the first fight, whenever she had any little success, whenever she dropped Pena with a low kick, whenever she'd land a big shot on the feet, she'd swarm Pena and look to get her out of there. That's why she adrenaline dumped. Look at the difference this time. Drops Pena, boom. Tries to get the finish with a ground and pound, but then she realises in this moment, okay, I dropped her, I landed a good shot, but she's recovered. She's defending herself well. No point in me jumping on top of her here and trying to kill her with ground and pound and risk adrenaline dumping. That's cool. No problem. And take some deep breaths. Catch my breath a little bit. Keep her on her back. You can get back up. No problem. Look at this. How different this is tactically from Nunes. And I don't want to go over this whole fight, which is 25 minutes long, explaining to you the differences in tactics from Nunes across the two fights. You can already see it for yourself. But what I need you to know is Nunes is a fighter that needs to be the hammer. She needs to dictate the pace. If you take the fight to her, if you dictate the pace, if you are the nail, if you force her to react to what you're doing, like Pena did in the first fight, Nunes falls apart. And so the question for us is, can Aldana force Amanda Nunes to fight at a pace that she is not setting and controlling herself, she is not in control of? And I think the answer is 100% yes. Why? Because she's a tough Mexican that has amazing cardio, is reasonably skilled everywhere, hits very hard, and fights at a high pace. Is she as skilled as Nunes? No. But being more skilled than Nunes is not the key to beating her, and Juliana Pena showed that. The key to beating Amanda Nunes is forcing her to fight at an unsustainable pace for her. And we've already spoken about how Aldana can do that on the ground, with how scrambly she is, how she's always attacking on the ground, forcing Nunes to exert energy on the ground. And we all saw how much energy it took out of Nunes in that first round of the Pena fight, the first fight, where there was a lot of activity on the ground. There were a lot of submission attempts from Nunes, a lot of takedowns, a lot of scrambles. Aldana can make her work hard on the ground too. But what I want to show you now is a little bit of footage of Aldana's style of fighting. And again, this breakdown's very long, but it's a complex fight, man. And there's no shortcuts in this game. I always say, making money betting on sports, one of the hardest endeavours in the world. One of the hardest things to do in the world. When you look at my football betting chart, we make a profit betting one of the most difficult sports in the world to make money on. The highest liquidity sport in the world. But I am profitable on it. Check this. Beautiful looking profitability chart. But it's fucking hard. It is fucking hard. You look at any type of pre-fight bet you want. Loose bets. Nice uptrend. Profitable. The best chart of all, the fucking granddaddy, is obviously live betting, my speciality. Look at this beautiful chart. You will not find a better looking chart than this. Non-stop profit over the last 8 years. Okay? The reason why I'm profitable on these sports is because the devil is in the detail. When you look at Nunes' career, everything that she brings to the table. The fact that she's fucking starched Holly Holm. I don't blame anyone for thinking Aldana's going to get smoked this weekend, but the devil is in the detail. Just a few weeks ago, we bet on Chase Hooper to beat Nick Fury. Chase Hooper was the underdog in that fight. The underdog. But we bet Hooper because we did the fight research and we saw Hooper was the kind of style to give Fury giant problems. Is Chase Hooper a good fighter? He's got a lot of weaknesses. He's a young guy with a lot to learn. I think he will be good one day, but right now, very green, a lot of weaknesses. But styles make fights, and we identified that Hooper was a nightmare of a stylistic matchup for Fury. Now, I believe Aldana is a nightmare of a stylistic matchup for Nunes. So if I show you a little bit of footage of Aldana in her fight against Macy Chiasson, you can see why. So remember how Nunes got into trouble in the first fight against Pena. It was because when Pena would come forward and attack her, she was meeting her head on. And they were clashing. They were getting into big exchanges. And neither girl would take a backward step. So Nunes burnt through a lot of energy. Now in the second fight, Pena struggled because Nunes decided to sit back and pick her shots instead. And because Pena is very bad defensively, it meant Nunes was catching her with those big power shots, knocking her down, inflicting a lot of damage. I'm not saying Nunes can't knock Aldana out or hurt her really bad on the feet. She certainly can. But the big difference between Irene Aldana and Juliana Pena is that her striking defense is really good. She's got a base in boxing. She's got good footwork, good movement. She understands distance a lot better than Pena did. So when Irene Aldana is coming forward and attacking Nunes, it isn't going to be as easy for Nunes to do what she did in the second fight against Pena and stand back and circle away and pick her shots and pace herself. It's going to be a lot harder because when Aldana comes forward and forces Nunes to engage, Aldana's footwork and movement is better, so it's going to be harder for Nunes to counter with those single power shots. It's also going to be harder for Nunes to circle away and evade Aldana because Aldana's the same size as her. She's not as small as Pena. She's faster than Pena, fights longer, hits harder. And so it's a whole different set of problems for Nunes to deal with. So what I want you to pay attention to in this first round is the willingness of Aldana to engage. What you notice about Aldana is she is constantly coming forward and attacking you. And in order to stop her from coming forward, you've got to do something. Like you see it here, right? Aldana's coming forward, pumping the jab. Chiasson's backing up, circling away. But every once in a while, when Aldana comes forward and looks to throw a strike, you've got to do something to back her up. And you can see Chiasson here, throwing some kicks. But as soon as Chiasson does something to back Aldana up, Aldana's right back on top of Chiasson, pressuring her. And you can see there's a little bit of an example of the takedown defense from Aldana as well. Like I say, her takedown defense isn't amazing, not terrible either. And you've got to think, when Nunes starts to get tired in the second half of the fight, she's probably not going to have the energy to take Aldana down. Look at this takedown defense. Aldana's takedown defense is as good as this in the fifth round. So it's, when Nunes is very tired, she's going to be forced to stand and strike with Aldana. And we all saw how that worked out for her in that first fight against Pena. But anyway, pay attention to Aldana. Look, they're back in the center of the octagon now. Look at what Aldana's doing. She's coming forward. She's pressuring Chiasson. Is there a lot of output? No. Is Aldana having a lot of success? No. She's not really landing a lot. She's not really having much success at all. But remember what the key to beating Amanda Nunes is. You make her work. Doesn't matter, how much success you have early. It's all about making her work. It's all about putting money in the bank. And the fact that Aldana is difficult to take down, difficult to hold down, and constantly comes forward and pressures you, means Nunes is, so long as Aldana fights like this, fights like she usually does, what this means is Nunes is going to be forced to burn through a lot of energy early, and she's not going to be able to pace herself like she has in the Pennington fight, like she has in the Shevchenko fight, like she has in the Pena fight, the rematch. Now, what are the biggest risks to Aldana in this fight? Well, obviously, she could get caught with a big shot and knocked out. Nunes hits extremely hard. What are the other risks? I do think there's a chance that Aldana could be put into a defensive shell, like, Raquel Pennington, where, Nunes just inflicts so much damage on her that she's not able to keep coming forward like this. She kind of becomes demoralized, goes into a defensive shell like Pennington did. That is possible, but what you can see here as this round has progressed is notice how Aldana is getting more aggressive now. Notice how earlier in this round she was coming forward and she wasn't really landing anything. There was no real end product. There was a lot of posturing, there was a lot of forward pressure. She wasn't really letting her hands go. Notice how now, towards the end of this round, there's a lot more activity, there's a lot more end product. She's taking the fight to Chiazon, she's getting in her face, she's chipping away at her from behind the jab. She's doing more, she's scoring more, she's forcing Chiazon to actually react to strikes now. So it's absolutely possible that Nunes could put Aldana into a defensive shell. It can happen. But from my perspective, Aldana's a tough Mexican. At the end of the day, like what are Mexican fighters famous for? They're famous for having, look at this takedown defense. Look at that. Look at that. And what famous for? They're famous for having legendary gas tanks. They're famous for not getting tired. They're famous for being tough as nails and aggressive. Pennington was a lot smaller than Nunes. No striking defense, no power in her hands. She found a way to win. Aldana is a big, strong, 5'9", tough Mexican with true legit knockout power and cardio for days. So it is possible Nunes could put her into a defensive shell. But typically speaking, it's not that easy to put tough Mexicans into a defensive shell. Not easy to make them quit. And you can see in this round how Aldana is slowly ramping up the aggression levels, slowly ramping up the pressure. If Nunes starts to fade just a little bit in this fight, Aldana's got the takedown defense to keep the fight standing and the boxing to really put it on Nunes and cause her big problems. So, for those reasons, I think Aldana's a brilliant bet this weekend, the big underdog odds. At the end of the day, it's a risky bet. Aldana does have bad fight IQ. She's quite passive at times. You've seen it there. There's not always a whole lot of end product from her forward pressure, and her grappling's not the best. But these two girls are at very different stages in their career. Aldana's hungry, motivated, wants to be the UFC champion. Amanda Nunes has done it all. She's seen it all. She made a bunch of money. She's talking about retirement. And if this Mexican dog turns this into a dog fight, based on that first fight against Juliana Pena, does Nunes have what it takes to dig deep, hang in there with Aldana, go toe-to-toe and find a way to get it done? I don't think she does at this stage in her career. So at decent underdog odds, I very much like a bet on Irene Aldana this week. So I hope you found that useful. Let me know what you think though. Let me know what you think in the comments below if you're watching on YouTube. If you're a member of my community, slide on into the brand new Discord. It's popping off, right boys? I gotta be honest, I really want to say a big thank you to everyone in the Discord community, because I was really nervous about setting up the Discord, because obviously our VIP chat room was decently busy, and what I didn't want was for discussions within the community to become diluted, where now we've got like 15-20 different channels in Discord server. Before, that VIP chat room would be pretty busy, where all day, every day, people would be like discussing things in there. I was worried that when we went to Discord, it would basically be like a ghost town, because the discussion would be too diluted across like crypto, NFT channels, and then we've got an MMA channel, we've got channels for talking about betting on football, tennis, we've got poker channels, video game channels. I was just worried that like the Discord would be really quiet, but man, like I really appreciate all of you for just like being in there every day, contributing. Like I love it. Like it's bad for me because I literally spend all day in there now, like chatting about random stuff, but I absolutely love it, like getting to talk to you guys about more things, like different things, and it's way busier in there. So Really appreciate you for being a part of it, man. So yeah, let me know what you think on Discord of the stuff we've just talked about in the MMA chat room on there, right? Let me know what you think. So we now want to think about the over-under on this one. I've got to be honest, I would be amazed if this fight went to a decision, because I just don't see how Nunes is going to be able to hang in there for 25 minutes without gassing out and getting finished, or Aldana getting knocked out. I'd be really, really, really surprised if this fight went to a decision. So I am, even though this is quite steep favourite odds, I am thinking about betting this, because the only two realistic scenarios I see for this one, like I say, are Aldana getting knocked out, or Nunes fading late on and getting stopped because she's too tired to defend herself, like in the Pena fight. And the only kind of scenario I could see where the fight would go to a decision, if it did go a similar way to the Pennington fight, where Nunes put Aldana into a defensive shell early, and then it was one of those fights where, like, Aldana just showed Nunes tons of respect, didn't attack her, let Nunes dictate the pace, and lost a boring decision. That might happen, but I think it's less likely than, quite a bit less likely than the other two scenarios. And when you compound and put those two most likely scenarios together, the Aldana getting knocked out or the Nunes fading and getting stopped, you know, these odds are decent. I think they are decent. So other props I'd be thinking about on this one: Aldana by knockout or TKO. I quite like that. We know she's got true legit knockout power. We've seen Nunes fade very, very hard against Pennington, and if she gets tired and sloppy in 6 or 7 minutes against Aldana like she did against Pena, Aldana can absolutely put her away. I'd also be quite interested in looking at things like Aldana to win in round 3 at odds of 25.0 plus 2,400, because no doubt Nunes is going to try and pace herself better than she did in the Pena fight. So, you know, probably doesn't get finished in the first or second like what happened in the first Pena fight. But Aldana to win in rounds 3 and rounds 4, rounds 5, it's quite attractive to me, particularly the round 4 and round 3 ones. So those are a couple more props that I like as well. But anyway, let me know what you think in the Discord. Let me know what you think in the comments below. And yeah, I hope you found that breakdown useful. Now let's break down the co-main event between Charles Oliveira and Beneil Dariush, and hopefully this breakdown isn't going to be as long as the one for the Nunes versus Aldana fight. So when I first saw the odds for this matchup, I was quite surprised that Dariush was the favourite. You know, taking nothing away from Dariush, he's a brilliant fighter, but with Oliveira being, you know, a former champion, and with Dariush not really facing any of the top guys in his run into the title picture, I was just surprised that he was the favourite. You know, on Dariush's run into this #1 contender fight, you know, he hasn't faced a lot of the guys that you usually have to go through to get into the title picture. You know, guys like Justin Gaethje, Dustin Poirier, even guys like Dan Hooker. I know Hooker's, you know, moved down to featherweight, but, you know, not like Dariush has beaten any top guys, right? Diego Ferreira's quite old, Holtzman's quite old, Ferguson, steep decline, Gamrot, you know, he's not really like a top 5, top tier lightweight. So yeah, to see Dariush going from facing like these mid-level dudes to being a favourite over Charles Oliveira, that's just interesting to me. So we can see that Dariush's odds are around about 1.67, which is going to be minus 149 for an implied probability of 60%. If we take a look at the odds on Oliveira, he's around an average of 2.25, which is going to be plus 125 for an implied probability of 44%. So Oliveira is 33 years old, 5'10", with a 74-inch reach, and Dariush, 34 years old, 5'10", with a 72-inch reach. So both guys roughly the same age, roughly the same size, nothing too major going on there. And it's always worth checking these days with these high profile fights how many rounds it's going to be. This is only a 3-rounder. I say that, because obviously recently Gilbert Burns, Belal Muhammad, which is a high profile fight but not a main event, they decided to make that a 5-rounder. So these days I always double check. It is going to be 5 rounds, which is good for both these guys because they do both have a tendency to slow as the fight wears on. They're both still tough, they're both still game, they're both still scrappy. I've gone blurry. There's no quitting either of them, don't get me wrong, but they definitely slow down as the fight wears on. So in terms of how these two match up from a stylistic point of view, in the Discord a few days ago, Ghoul, who's obviously a long-term member of our community, he researched this fight and he posted in the MMA channel in Discord that Dariush would have the advantage on the ground. And when he said that, I think I said something to him like, are you sure? Like, for me, I would have assumed that Oliveira would have had the advantage if this fight went to the ground. But you know what? Ghoul's absolutely right. Dariush definitely has the edge on the ground. And I think the big difference between these two on the ground is that Dariush is just a better MMA grappler. The issue with Charles Oliveira is that while he is a very high-level Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu black belt, very dangerous submission grappler, his problem is that he doesn't have a great deal of physicality on the ground, and he doesn't always understand the importance of position over submission. He's got nasty chokes, slick back takes, but what got him into trouble against Makhachev was his lack of physicality and also his lack of positional awareness, where he would choose to attack with submissions and, you know, try and improve his position on the ground rather than just obtain control and rack up points controlling you. Dariush's grappling control is a lot better in my opinion. His MMA grappling's a lot better, his wrestling's a lot better, and for me he's a skilled enough black belt to probably be able to defend himself against Oliveira's submission game. And the thing with Oliveira is, generally speaking, his submission game's only really dangerous for the first 6 or 7 minutes. If you can make it through that first 6 or 7 minutes, and when he starts to tire, his submission game's nowhere near as dangerous. So for me, if these two were in a BJJ contest, now I have no idea who would win. I don't really know. But in terms of MMA grappling, for me, Dariush's positional awareness gives him the edge, and I also think he's a bit more physically imposing on the ground as well. So definitely give Dariush the edge there. But when it comes to striking, the fight gets quite a bit more complicated, because Oliveira throws a really diverse range of strikes. He's got good boxing, a great kicking game, good knees, good elbows. He fights at a really high pace as well. He's a high pressure fighter. And Dariush is just nowhere near as technical. Not only does he not throw as much as Oliveira, but he doesn't throw the same diversity of attacks, and there's just not the same sharpness to his technique. So this is one of those matchups where I give Dariush the edge on the ground, because I think his ability to control and be more positionally aware means he's more likely to be in dominant positions if the fight did go to the ground. But on the feet, I give Oliveira the edge. I think he's more technical. I even think he's better defensively. He's certainly more dangerous. So there's a higher volume of strikes and a much more diverse range of strikes. So this is one of those fights where I really don't have a strong opinion on it at all, because you give Oliveira the edge on the feet, you give Dariush the edge on the ground, but it's difficult to know where the fight's going to take place. Both guys like to stand and bang. Both guys like to stand and strike. So will their grappling kind of cancel itself out, right? Will both guys struggle to get the other down? Will both guys struggle to have any success on the ground because they neutralize one another, and therefore, you know, will the fight stay standing, and will this turn into a kickboxing match between two guys that are primarily grapplers? If that happens, you give Oliveira the edge. Obviously, if the fight were to go to the ground, and both these guys were to take the fight to their area of expertise, which is grappling, then for me that would favour Dariush. So it's one of those fights I don't lean too confidently on either way, and seems like most people feel that way because the odds are in the even money odds range. So for me, the way I would look at a fight like this, where I don't have a particularly good feeling on it, is I would, if you're one of these people that really want to bet the fight to make watching it more interesting, I would just take the underdog for the better risk to reward ratio. If you don't really know what's going to happen, but you want to gamble for some fun, $100 on Oliveira. If he wins, you're going to get 125 back. Do the same on Dariush, you only get 67 back. I'm not touching this fight, like I said. I don't have a good feeling on it, but I would just bet Oliveira. I think this is doggo pass. So, in terms of the over-under on this fight, it is a tricky one because on one hand, we know Oliveira brings absolute violence. He likes to come forward, pressure his opponents, force them to exchange, and he's very dangerous both standing up and on the ground. Both guys also have a tendency to slow, so it may get to the point where one of these is too tired to defend themselves in the second half of the fight and gets finished that way. So because Oliveira forces the action, he brings the violence. Because they both slow down, I do understand why the fight not to go to a decision is at steep favourite odds. Having said that, again, like with a money line, I think you've got to let the odds do the work for you here. And for me, it's an absolute no-brainer that if you really want to bet the over-under on this one, you've got to take the over. Far better risk to reward ratio in the odds. It's not as likely as the fight ending inside the distance, but far better risk to reward ratio. And, you know, it's not unusual for these guys to go to a decision. You can see this fight almost went to a decision, went very deep. Ferguson fight went to a decision. This fight went very deep. You look at Dariush's record. You know, his last 3 fights have gone to a decision. So for me, I do understand why the odds on fight not to go to a decision are favourite. But might be a bit of value in this. And I might actually bet this myself. It's very tempting. Very, very tempting. Because, you know, especially if this turns into a grappling match. If there's a lot of grappling in this fight. You could easily see a situation where, you know, it's just a high-level jiu-jitsu match, which ends up going the distance because neither guy can submit the other because they're both too skilled to be submitted. So, yeah, that definitely gives you the better risk to reward ratio. Now, in terms of the props on this one, what do we like? What do we like? What do we like? Nothing I really like. My problem with a prop bet on a fight like this is because there's so many different ways that it could play out. It's very difficult to nail down a prop that you feel good about because we don't really know if it's going to take place on the feet or on the ground. So favouring submission props versus knockout TKO props is quite difficult. Again, because we don't know whether it's taking place standing up or on the ground, we don't really know whether a win by decision or inside the distance is more likely. So it's just a tricky one. There's no real props I feel great about this. If you really want to just be a bit loose and just place a bet on a prop to make watching the fight more interesting, I don't hate fight ends in round 3. The odds of 14.0 plus 1,300. Just because, like I say, both guys are very dangerous. They both have a tendency to slow. So you could end up in a situation where one guy's too tired to defend themselves. You know, if you look at Oliveira's record, you know, 3rd round finish there, 3rd round finish there. Same can't really be said for Dariush, to be fair, but you know, when you've got 2 guys that have a tendency to slow, you know, not always a bad idea to bet the fight to end in round 3. So I hope you found that breakdown video useful. Now let's break down the next fight on this card, which is Adam Fugitt. I'm sure it's not pronounced like that, no disrespect Adam, and Mike Mallot. So if we start off by taking a look at the odds on this one, we can see that Mallot is the favourite at average odds of around, where is he? There we go. Average odds of around 1.48, which is going to be minus 208 for an implied probability of 68%. And if we take a look at the odds on Fugitt, we'll just call him Fugitt. He's a 2.70 underdog, which is plus 170 for an implied probability of 37%. So Fugitt is 34 years old, 6'1" with a 77-inch reach. Mallot, 31 years old, 6'1" with a 73-inch reach. So you can see Both guys roughly the same age, same height. Fugitt has a 4-inch reach advantage, which is very nice. But one other X factor to take into consideration on this one is that Mallot is from Canada, and this event is obviously taking place in Canada. And so we know home advantage is a pretty big deal in Canada. Statistically speaking, Canadian fighters win around 65% of the time when they're facing non-Canadians in Canada. So we know if the fight is relatively close, relatively competitive, judges are more likely to give the Canadian the nod. And on the flip side, obviously, the crowd are really going to be behind Mallot, supporting him. You know, he's going to be able to feed off the energy of the crowd, whereas, you know, having the crowd on your back probably going to not feel great for Fugitt. Home advantage is a big deal in any sport. If you think about it, it's like the same effect as having a personal trainer, where, you know, where it's like when you start to get tired and you're working out, or you go for a run, you're on the treadmill by yourself, it's very easy to quit when the going gets tough. As soon as you start to feel some discomfort, as soon as you start to get tired, very easy to just quit, go eat some Doritos, play some video games. But it's a lot harder to quit when you're working out with a personal trainer, because they hold you accountable. And so when you're feeling really tired and your lungs are burning and you're exhausted, if you're working out by yourself, it's easy to quit. With a personal trainer, not so easy to quit. They push you to keep going. And the crowd in MMA fights where home advantage is in play can have that same effect. If Mallot's starting to feel tired, the crowd may just give him that little boost in energy. If Mallot starts to, you know, doubt himself, maybe they can pick him up, make him a little bit more confident. And, you know, on the flip side, anytime Mallot has any success in this fight, the crowd are going to be right behind him. So if I could get caught with a big shot, or, you know, starts to struggle, starts to get tired himself, and the crowd really start to get behind Mallot and energize him, that could be demoralizing for Fugitt. So home advantage is a big deal, and it favors Mallot this weekend. So in terms of how these two match up stylistically, it's not the easiest fight to predict, because there's not really that much footage available on Mallot. If we take a look at his record, every single one of his fights, remember this is a grappling match, so every single one of his MMA fights in the last 6 years, sorry, I go back even further, every single one of his MMA fights in the last 8 years has ended very quickly in round 1. So there's a lot that we don't know about Mallot. We don't know anything about his cardio. We don't know a whole lot about his striking. We don't know a whole lot about how he performs when put in bad positions. Now, what you can do is go all the way back to 2015, 8 years ago, and watch his fight against Thomas Diania, which did go to a decision, to kind of get a look at his cardio and his pacing, how he looks in the second and third round, how his striking looks. But obviously that fight was such a long time ago. You know, Mallot would have been in his early 20s when that fight took place. And so it's a little bit unfair to judge him on this performance, because he's likely to have improved so much since this fight 8 years ago. And I gotta be honest, he didn't look good against Diania. What kind of happened was, he came out the gate hard, did pretty well in round 1, then faded pretty hard, which might happen again because he doesn't have much experience going past round 1. But we don't have any evidence to know either way, because there's just no footage of how he's going to look. So I can talk about how these two match up stylistically, but Mallot for me is a little bit of an unknown. What I'm really hoping for is that this fight turns out to be, you know, one of those grueling wars of attrition that goes 3 rounds, and we get a good look at, you know, all aspects of Mallot's game: takedown defense, ground game, cardio, chin, striking. And then in his next fight we can get a better read on it. But for now, for me, this fight is more of a wait and see. Just wait and see how he looks, and learn a bit more about him. So based on what we know, based on past performances, Mallot's striking's pretty good. When I say pretty good, if you go back and watch him in Bellator in 2015, his striking was non-existent. He looked dreadful. But you can definitely see in his last 2-3 performances, he's a lot more comfortable, a lot more confident on the feet now than he was back in that Bellator fight from 2015. So striking's pretty fluid. aggressive, big power in his hands, you know, pretty technical, looks pretty decent. He's obviously primarily a grappler, you know, strong offensive wrestler, good grappling control, you know, dangerous submission game, but you know, we don't know how he's going to look into the second and third round. We don't know what his takedown defense is like. We don't know what he's like off his back. So it's a tricky one. Now, Fugitt is primarily a striker. He does grapple, but his grappling's not particularly good. He's a little bit scrappy, a little bit sloppy, quite a low-level grappler. So Fugitt likes to stand in sort of like a sideways kind of karate stance, like not full on, you know, Stephen Thompson MVP style, but in a sideways stance, hands down relatively low, chin up high and exposed, and he just looks to chip away at his opponents from that long sideways stance. Defensively, he's pretty bad though, so doesn't read his opponents particularly well, gets caught cold with a lot of big hard shots, and so he will be very vulnerable on the feet against Mallot, who does appear to be very dangerous, very fast as well. When it comes to grappling, Fugitt's one of these guys that commits really hard takedowns, but his ground game, generally speaking, is quite low level. It's nowhere near the level of Mallot. But where this fight could get interesting is obviously if Mallot were to slow, you know, past round one with him not having a whole lot of experience fighting past the first round, then Fugitt is certainly capable of making him pay. And like, Fugitt's cardio is not amazing, but he is a dog that can go hard for 3 rounds. Like, you know, his fight against Michael Morales showed that. Sure, he faded in that fight, but it was his UFC debut, and you know, he's had the energy to get late finishes in the past. So this is one of those fights where if Mallot can fight for 3 rounds, how he can for 1 round, it's a very, very difficult fight for Fugitt. But there is a potential Mallot might fade in this one. We'll have to keep an eye on it. Who knows? So in terms of whether or not, I was going to move on to the over-under, but I'll wrap up the money line. Without really knowing a whole lot about Mallot, very difficult to bet this fight. For me, like I say, not interested in betting this one. What I'm hoping for is that we learn more about Mallot this weekend that we can then use to bet his future fights. We just haven't seen a whole lot of him in the last 8 years. And because that fight in Bellator was so long ago, don't really want to judge him on that because he's likely improved so much since then. So in terms of the over-under, I don't really have an opinion on it because, like I say, Mallot's an unknown. You can take a really simplified approach to, you know, working out whether or not the fight's likely to go the distance or not, and say, well, most of Mallot's fights end in the distance. Most of Fugitt's fights end in the distance too. Therefore, this fight's probably going to end inside the distance as well. I get that logic completely, but for me, I like to make betting decisions based on what I actually know. I don't like to make assumptions. You know what they say? Assumption is the mother of all fuck-ups, Tommy. And so I don't want to make assumptions with this one. Don't know enough about Mallot to really feel confident here. So in terms of the props, exactly the same deal. I can't pick out highly specific outcomes on a fight like this without really knowing a whole lot about Mallot. So I hope you found that breakdown useful. Now let's move on to one of the most interesting fights on the main card, maybe even the most interesting fight on the main card, between Dan Ige and Nate Landwehr. And I say potentially the most interesting fight on the main card only because Landwehr is always fun to watch. Whenever Landwehr is on the card, you know you're going to need to do something special to get a fight of the night bonus because you know he's bringing war. And so this is going to be a great fight because Ige isn't the kind of guy to shy away from an exchange or take a backward step. So if you take a look at the odds on this one, Ige, the favourite, average odds were about 1.39. It's going to be minus 256 for an implied probability of 72%. If we take a look at the odds on Landwehr, he's around an average of 3.0. Lost my place. 3.0, which is going to be plus 210 for an implied probability of 32%. So Ige, 31 years old, 5'7", with a 71-inch reach. Landwehr, 35 years old, 5'9", with a 70.5-inch reach. Both guys roughly the same age, I guess. Landwehr is getting pretty old for a featherweight, to be fair. He's going to be 36 next month, which is really, really old for a featherweight. But in his defence, he does actually appear to be improving. He's not showing any signs of decline, so that's not a massive issue for me. And obviously, he is a little bit taller than Ige. Both have the same reach. So this is a real interesting matchup. Because both guys like to get into big exchanges. Both guys like to go toe-to-toe. Both guys like to go to war. In that kind of fight, in my opinion, that definitely favours Dan Ige. Because not only do I think he has the better chin, but I also think he has more power offensively as well. For me, I know Landwehr does have some finishes. I know he is a dangerous striker. But for me, he's more of a volume striker that wears you down with pressure, aggression and volume. Doesn't really have the kind of power to just put you away with one shot. Has he caught guys with big shots throughout his career? Sure he has, like most MMA fighters have at some point. But for the most part, Landwehr is a high pressure, high volume striker that just looks to put it on you from the first second to the last and break you with pressure. Whereas Ige, he's got big power. Changed his nickname to 50k. He used to be Dynamite, Dan Ige. I mean, he's got absolute dynamite in his hands. Major, major power. True legit one-shot knockout power. Knocked out Damon Jackson in his last fight. You know, over the last few years, he hasn't scored a whole lot of knockouts. He's only scored 2 knockouts of Gavin Tucker and Damon Jackson. But I think a big part of this is the step up in competition that he faced, because there was that period where Ige was looking like a heavy-handed knockout artist, and then all of a sudden he wasn't really looking as dangerous on the feet. But I think this is because he started facing guys who were elite strikers in the title picture. You know, look at it. You got guys like Edson Barboza back in 2020, top level striker. Calvin Kattar, we know, very tough, difficult to get out of there. Korean Zombie, granite chin, tough as nails. Josh Emmett, tough as nails, granite chin. Movsar Evloev, same story. But then when he drops down, faces that lower level fighter who's not in the top 5, not in the top 10 featherweight picture, guys like Gavin Tucker, guys like Damon Jackson, he looks a lot more dangerous. So this is an interesting fight because it's kind of power versus volume, where Landwehr is going to be looking to put it on Ige and outstrike him, and Ige is going to be looking to try and stay outside the range where he can be hit and catch Landwehr with that singular big shot that's going to put him away and really hurt him. Because we know Ige doesn't throw a whole lot of volume. You know, it's one of the main reasons why he's lost so many decisions. It's just because he doesn't do a whole lot. He is quite passive at times. He is quite tentative. He is very guilty of headhunting. He's always trying to load up and catch you with that big shot. And if he catches you with a big shot like Damon Jackson found out, you're in a lot of trouble. But otherwise, he's quite easy to outpoint. So this is one of those matchups where I think if Ige doesn't win inside the distance, he's probably going to lose a decision, because I don't think he's going to be able to keep up with the pace or the work rate of Landwehr. And so we've got to ask ourselves the question, what is the probability of Ige knocking Landwehr out? And to be fair, Ige's got a decent chance of knocking Landwehr out here. If you go back and watch any of Landwehr's fights, you'll notice that his striking defense is really fucking bad. So if you go and watch his fight against Austin Lingo, you know, early on Lingo was causing him a lot of problems with forward pressure, aggression, damaged Landwehr a fair bit in that fight. He took big shots in the David Onama fight. You know, he was wobbled a few times, was in a lot of trouble. Obviously, he was knocked out by Julian Erosa. You know, knocked out against Herbert Burns. Took loads of damage against Darren Elkins, which is concerning, because obviously Elkins isn't the most dangerous striker. So this is one of those fights where Landwehr is a sitting duck to the knockout. He's far more likely to get knocked out in this than Dan Ige. He's very, very vulnerable. So the question is, can he avoid getting knocked out for 15 minutes? It won't be easy, because he likes to exchange. He loves a scrap. He loves to stand and bang. And Ige isn't really the kind of guy that you want to be standing and banging with if you're not the best defensively, which Landwehr isn't. But what is interesting about this fight is that I do think Landwehr could potentially have some success with his grappling. I know Dan Ige has a base in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu. He started life as a grappler. But one of Ige's biggest problems is that his takedown defense isn't great. And he quite often spends too long on the ground, either hunting for long shot submissions or not showing enough urgency to work his way back up to his feet. Landwehr actually said in the press conference today that he's coming out to try and take Ige down. And this is one of those matchups where Ige is definitely the more technically skilled grappler. High level Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, for example. Landwehr's grappling isn't good. But I think similar to the Oliveira Dariush fight, what could be the difference here is that Landwehr is much more positionally aware. I think he's a better MMA grappler than Dan Ige. If these two guys were to get into a BJJ tournament, Ige would probably dominate him. But this is not a BJJ contest, it is mixed martial arts. And I think Landwehr's offensive wrestling, grappling control, positional awareness is a lot better than Ige's. And I think there is an opportunity there for Landwehr to steal rounds with takedowns and score a decent amount of points by racking up some top control off of some takedowns. So it's an interesting fight because, you know, both guys have areas where they can cause the other the problem. In terms of Ige not being able to keep up with Landwehr's pace or volume. Landwehr likely have an advantage when it comes to grappling, but then Ige having the power in his hands to really damage Landwehr and make him pay for his bad defense. We also know Ige's got brilliant leg kicks, and Landwehr doesn't do a particularly good job of checking leg kicks or addressing them. So he's going to be a sitting duck to Ige's extremely dangerous leg kicking game. So in terms of how I view this fight from a betting point of view, from my perspective, you'd have to be absolutely crazy to bet Ige is a big favourite here. It just doesn't make sense. Even if you're Dan Ige's twin brother and you love him to death and you're super confident he's going to win, it would still be very foolish to bet him here, because if you look at his odds, they carry an implied probability of about 72%, which means you've got to give Ige like a 75% chance of winning this to get any value. And for me, that is impossible, because we know he's very passive, he's very tentative. It's the reason why he loses so many decisions. And we know Landwehr is very aggressive, fights at a high pace, so he could easily outwork Ige. We also know Ige has got some issues on the ground, so while he is the better technical grappler than Landwehr, sometimes spends too long on the bottom, you know, too long hunting for long shot submissions, too long allowing his opponents to control him, which does give Landwehr opportunities to have a little bit of success with grappling. So for me, this fight is absolutely dog or pass. You have to bet Landwehr if you really want to bet this fight. I'm not going to be betting this fight. I'm going to pass on this one just because I don't like placing bets in situations where a fighter's biggest weakness can be exploited particularly well by their opponents. So for example, I am betting Aldana this weekend in a similar odds range to Nate Landwehr, because I don't think Nunes is particularly well equipped to exploit any of Aldana's weaknesses. In terms of, I don't think Nunes can grapple hard for 25 minutes, so I'm not particularly worried about Aldana's issues on the ground, because I don't think Nunes is going to be able to out-grapple her in the 3rd, 4th and 5th when Nunes starts to get tired. I also don't think Nunes' power poses too much of a threat to Aldana, because she's a tough Mexican with good boxing, good footwork, good movement. Therefore, I'm happy to take the gamble on Aldana, because I don't really worry too much about anything that Nunes is bringing to the table, other than just being a decent overall fighter. But when it comes to Landwehr, it's different, because Landwehr's biggest weakness is poor striking defense, and he does tend to get rocked, dropped, wobbled, knocked down a lot. And we know Ige has huge power in his hands. So for me, it's just not a fight I can bet. I wouldn't feel good having my money on either side. I think no matter who you bet in this fight, you're not getting a particularly good risk to reward ratio. Now in terms of fight to go to a decision or not, you can see it's in the even money odds range. And again, it is a tricky one. I can understand why this is in the even money odds range, because we've literally spelled out that there's probably 2 ways this is going to go, and it's very difficult to predict which way it's going to go. You're probably going to either see Landwehr out hustle and outwork Ige and win a decision, or you're going to see Landwehr made to pay for his poor defense, and we're going to see Ige knock him out. So it's one of those situations where I feel like maybe betting the over-under is kind of the same as betting the money line. Because if you bet on the fight to go to a decision, essentially you're betting Landwehr to win, because I don't think Ige is going to be busy enough to win a decision against Landwehr. If you bet on it to end inside the distance, you're probably just betting on Ige to win by knockout, because it's very unlikely Landwehr finishes Ige. So yeah, I don't know really. Don't feel confident either way. I think the bookies are right to have this in the even money odds range. I don't lean too confidently either way on it. You know, you look at their records, and you know Ige does fight to a lot of decisions. Landwehr has fought to couple decisions as well in the UFC. The Klein fight obviously went deep. That almost went to a decision. So it's situation where 1, 2, 3 of Landwehr's 6 UFC fights almost went to a decision. So you could kind of say the fight's more likely to go to a decision because Ige usually goes to a decision. Landwehr has been to a decision in 50% of his fights in the UFC. But on the flip side, from a stylistic point of view, you know that Ige hits extremely hard, has got devastating knockout power, and we know Landwehr's striking defense is really, really bad. So it's one of those things where on paper you'd probably say the fight is more likely to go to a decision, but then when you consider how they match up stylistically, you could see the fight not go into a decision. So yeah, it is a tricky one. In terms of the props on this one, Landwehr by decision is, if I were going to bet a prop, which I'm not going to, I'm not going to be betting this fight, but I do think Landwehr by decision is probably the prop that gives you the best risk to reward, simply because Ige to win by knockout at TKO is really steep. Like, these are really steep odds. There's very tight odds. So yeah, Landwehr by decision is what I would go for if you just want to bet this fight. A little bit of money to make watching it more entertaining, although I don't know why you would want to do that, because I have a feeling this fight's going to be super entertaining, because Landwehr is always worth the entry fee. He's brilliant. He's so much fun to watch. So I hope you found that breakdown useful. Now let's break down the final fight on this main card. Let's talk about the fight between Eric Anders and Marc-Andre Barriault. So this is one of the very few fights on the card in the even money odds range. Last week we had loads of fights in the even money odds range. This week it's only 3 out of the 11 fights. We've got Barriault as the favourite at average odds of about 1.74. And we have got, which is minus 135 for an implied probability of 57%. And if we take a look at the odds on Anders, he's around an average of 2.15. It's going to be plus 115 for an implied probability of 47%. So Anders is 36 years old, 6'1", with a 75-inch reach. And Barriault is 33 years old, 6'1", with a 74-inch reach. So both guys roughly the same age, roughly the same size. What's interesting about this fight from a stylistic point of view is they both pretty much have the same weaknesses as well. Both Anders and Andre Barriault's biggest weaknesses throughout their careers have been that they're very inconsistent. They're very passive and tentative at times, where they have long periods of inactivity, where they don't really score points and do very much. And they also struggle to put their stamp on rounds, and they also both have quite bad fight IQ, and they don't really show a lot of urgency in fights. But something else that these two have got in common is that they are both improving in those areas. Even Eric Anders, who at 36 years old is getting pretty old now. We saw in his last fight against Kaldorkas that he completely abandoned the passive, tentative, version of himself, which in the past has not done very much. The kind that we saw against Jun Yong Park and the kind we saw against Darren Stewart, even in a fight against Krzysztof Jotko. Usually Anders does a whole lot of nothing. Swings at air, spends a long time battling for position in the clinch without really achieving very much, and just a guy that, generally speaking, lets rounds slip away from him and doesn't do a whole lot. But then in his last fight against Kaldorkas, he came out the gate super aggressive, took the fight to Dorcas from the first second, got in his face, put a lot of pressure on him, broke him and got him out of there in round 2. So that was a sign that Anders had turned a corner, because he'd never really done that before. We'd never really seen that aggressive version of Anders that really took the fight to his opponent. Is that just a one-off, or is that a change in mentality and a change in style? And that's what makes betting this fight quite tricky, because the version of Anders that we get this weekend determines how I feel about it from a betting point of view. Because if the version of Anders that fought Jun Yong Park or Darren Stewart or Christoph Jotko or Gerald Meerschaert shows up, the passive, tentative version that lets rounds slip away from him, doesn't really do very much apart from battle for position in the clinch, if that version shows up, I think Andre Barrio outworks him and wins a decision. But if the aggressive version of Anders shows up, the fought Dorcas, this fight gets a lot more interesting, and in that instance, they don't really have a lean. At the end of the day, you're only as good as your last fight, and so it would make sense for him to show up and perform like he did against Dorcas, especially because it worked, right? It worked. It was one of his most dominant performances in the UFC. Might even be the most dominant performance in the UFC. So you'd anticipate he would do that again, but you never know. When you're dealing with a fighter like Anders that is inconsistent, that does have bad fight IQ, you never really know what version of him you're going to get. Never really know what game plan or strategy they're going to use. So it is dangerous to try and anticipate what a guy like Eric Anders is going to do. Now, Barrio has got all the same weaknesses that Anders has, or has had in the past. Passive, tentative, long periods of inactivity, struggles to put his stamp on rounds, bad fight IQ, bad decision making. This is something that plagued Marc-Andre Barrio for a big stretch of his UFC career. But then, in recent fights, he's really turned a corner, and he's looked a lot more aggressive against Dalcha Lungambula, Abu Aizatar, Jordan Wright, even Anthony Hernandez, Julian Marquez. And so, even though Andre Barrio is a little inconsistent, what's different about Andre Barrio is that he's given us a lot more evidence to suggest that he has turned the corner, and from here on out he will be fighting a lot more aggressive. Whereas with Eric Anders, we've only seen it in his last fight against Carl Dorcas, so he could easily slip back to his old ways and fight passive and tentative again, like he did against Jun Yong Park. Old habits die hard. So this is one of those matchups where I don't think how they match up skill for skill from a technical point of view has very much to do with who's going to win this, because they're both reasonably skilled everywhere. They're both tough, they've both got good chins, they're both difficult to take down, they're both difficult to hold down, both got good cardio, both reasonably good everywhere. Neither of them have really got any knockout power. They're more volume strikers, right? So they're pretty well matched skill for skill, which is why I think the odds are in the even money odds range. And what this fight is going to come down to is fight IQ, decision making, game planning. Who is smart enough to put their stamp on a round? Who paces themselves better? Who's more tactical? Who's more strategic? That's who's going to win this. And for that reason, my lean is going to be Marc-Andre Barrio, simply because, like I said, in many of his fights over the last couple of years, he's really turned the corner. He's been more aggressive, more tactical. He's fought smarter. Therefore, I have more trust in Barrio to show up and perform to his full potential. Whereas with Anders, because he's been very passive and tentative for the majority of his UFC career and really only showed an aggressive side of himself in his last fight, it's far more difficult for me to trust Anders to show up and perform to his full potential than it is for me to trust Barrio. Therefore, in the even money odds range, gun to my head, Barrio is my lean. But if both guys show up and perform to their full potential, I think it'll be a really competitive fight, because they're both very well matched, both very well balanced, both pretty fucking good everywhere, and realistically, neither of them from a technical point of view really have any weaknesses. They're both decent on the ground, they're both hard to take down and hold down. Striking defense is pretty good, chin's pretty good, not bad offensively. They're not the most powerful or dangerous, but they do throw with good volume, they do throw with a diversity of attacks. Two really well-rounded middleweights here, and this is great matchmaking from the UFC. But I honestly think this one's going to come down to strategy, game planning, fight IQ, and my lean on this fight is Barrio, because I feel he's a little bit better in those areas than Anders. In fact, quite a decent amount better. But the Dorcas fight does complicate things a little bit. So in terms of the over-under on this one, I am strongly considering betting the over. Haven't bet it yet, but I am giving it a lot of thought, just because throughout their UFC careers, both these guys have been total decisionators. If you look at Anders, he has had, how many fights has he had in the UFC? So there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15 fights in the UFC. And 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 8 of his 15 fights in the UFC have gone to a decision. This one was 18 seconds away from going to a decision, though. Very, very close. And this one was a no contest. You can kind of take that out. So you can see, taking this fight out, where he's only had 14 fights in the UFC, if we just acknowledge this one didn't exist. And then if you count this as a decision, because actually if you count this one as a decision as well, that one went into the third round. So if you were to count these two as decisions, because they both practically did go to a decision, then out of his 14 fights in the UFC, you would have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. 10 of his 14 fights in the UFC go into a decision. If you look at Barrio's record, he has had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 fights in the UFC. 1, 2, 3. Count this one's 4 seconds off going to a decision. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Again, this one almost went to a decision. But anyway, you can see both guys fight to a decision quite often. Because neither of them have knockout power, neither of them are particularly dangerous on the ground, and because they're both pretty tough, both pretty well-rounded, I think there's a really good chance this one goes to a decision. So I quite like that. I'd probably be betting that myself. In terms of the props, the only one I would consider is Barrio by decision. The odds aren't great, so I'm not going to be betting it myself, but if you're one of these guys that likes to place a bet on every fight to make watching the fights more interesting, Barrio by decision is the best prop, I think. So I hope you found that useful. Thank you very much for watching. I hope you make loads of money this weekend and do really good. Please check out my website, MMABettingTips.com. I strongly recommend checking out the live betting tips. I know that is like asking a chef how he thinks his food tastes. Very impartial, very biased. But come give it a try. Like I say, if you don't like it, you get a refund, no problem. And yeah, it's a great card to give it a try over. I've just remembered something that I completely forgot to mention on the Barrio fight, which we need to talk about before we wrap this up. So I completely forgot to mention in the X Factors that Barrio is Canadian, and there is a likelihood this fight will be pretty competitive. So with Barrio being Canadian, this fight being in Canada, crowd are going to be well behind him. I actually think that gives him a pretty big edge, because I do think this is very likely to go to a decision, and I don't think Anders is the kind of guy to win this fight decisively because of how well matched they are. So for that reason, Barrio being Canadian makes me feel a lot better about him winning this. So anyway, hope you found that useful. Thank you very much for watching. Take care. See you in